The other side of this is nationalism. Now, nationalism is different than citizenship in that it is not a legal agreement, it is more a shared idea amongst people that could take several forms. One is advocating for one's own people, often at the expense or detriment of others. So that could be advocating for Americans more than people of other countries. It could be advocating for people of a certain race or region or nationality or religion. Anything that has a common shared element amongst people could create a nation and thus create nationalism, advocating for that nation. It could also be a desire simply for recognition of the existence of that identity, that shared group of people. So a very clear and obvious example in our political system of nationalism is basically Donald Trump's entire campaign, right? A Make America First. The idea that the United States should prioritize Americans and American interests over that of all others. This is something we see around the world in various governments, prioritizing the people of that country. This is also not new to the United States. In fact, it's been the driving agenda of most presidents throughout most of American history. Trump just made it bigger and bolder and attached a certain racial element to it as well. When they said make America first, they often were referring to pretty implicitly particular version of the United States that involved white skin. Another example could be the Scottish independence movement. So people in Scotland that share the common identity of being Scottish and not wanting to be ruled by the United Kingdom and the English government. And so they've had referendums where they vote whether or not Scotland wants to be independent from the United Kingdom. This is an example of nationalism as well. So nationalism doesn't always mean racism. It doesn't always mean something inherently discriminatory. It could sometimes just mean recognition. It also doesn't always mean wanting your own country, like the Scottish. So an example could be the American Indian movement, especially in the 60s and 70s, a push for recognition, of American Indian tribes and a desire for recognition of tribal and treaty rights to establish reservations in independent communities, but also simply for civil rights within the grander United States, but at no point pushing for, say, an independent country necessarily, although reservations operate semi-similar to independent countries, as we will examine later in this course. Another example could be the biggest free breakfast program in the history of the United States, that is the Black Panther Party. The Black Panthers advocated for a shared identity for African Americans nationwide and looked for acknowledgement of that shared identity and that nation within the United States without advocating for their own independent country. They simply wanted autonomy, recognition of their civil rights as Americans, but specifically as Americans who had experienced a very particular condition within the history of this country. And were continuing to at the time that the Black Panthers were at the peak of their enrollment. The other side of this, and this isn't to say that these groups are at all equivalent morally or functionally, but white nationalists, so people who believe that the American identity should be based around a nation specifically centered on white race. Now, historically, the term white has morphed and changed pretty dramatically in its definition. So who is considered white or not white is, of course, a human construction, and that has changed significantly. But the basis of the white nationalist movement is effectively that the United States should base its power structure around whiteness and around a certain culture that is inherently discriminatory towards people who they deem not white. And they base their American identity on whiteness rather than simply being part of the country. You see in these two last examples, two particular instances wherein one instance of nationalism is to advocate for discrimination particularly and to center power and access to resources around one particular group, whereas the other form of nationalism is simply a recognition to expand rights and expand power to a group that has not historically had it and to advocate for oneself. So nationalism being used in two very different contexts in these two examples.